You remember being a kid and getting asked what you wanted to be when you grew up, with the implication being you could be anything? How many of your parents asking this question were celebrities or astronauts or famous musicians? You ever think to ask your dad if he really wanted to create formulas and spreadsheets for the rest of his life? I'm going to guess the answer is no, because what they were doing was filling our heads with a fantasy world that didn't exist. It was always a lie, but it fed into a mythological framework of thinking that all of us who were raised in American schools were inculcated with. Our history books were filled with the stories of our pantheon of gods, the founding fathers, these mythological figures that fought against brutal tyranny and forged a country from their grit and determination. And there were a series of traits and characteristics we were led to believe were moral and righteous and set us apart. We had American exceptionalism. We were a moral people, humble, filled with a passion for hard work and paving our own way. We kept our heads down and were reverent in the hands of an angry God, a nation of entrepreneurs that believed in the greatness of the capitalist free market. Essentially, a laundry list of platitudes whose definitions, importantly, would always remain fluid, and this primed us to be manipulated and abused by a system completely aware that this entire mythological framework created a religious adherence to a particular way of life, and that by creating this almost subconscious fealty to these American values, they could make us believe and behave in ways that benefited them. Them, in this instance, being the hegemony, the pervasive cultural values and norms upheld by the ruling class of wealthy elites, millionaires and billionaires hell-bent on ensuring the wealth they inherited would always keep them at the top of the social pecking order, and of course asserting control and dominance over the working class and poor. This mythological framework of American living is ubiquitous. It's in every story we read, every movie we watch. Our textbooks are written through this lens. Our parents and their parents were raised with these ideals. The advertisements we watch and the books we read are filled with it. You can't throw a stone in this country without hitting some reflection of this idea of the American dream and American exceptionalism and rugged individualism. All of our political leaders craft an origin story steeped in this propaganda. Going against it makes you a social pariah. And because we have this framework already implanted in our brains, the hegemonic structure can maintain its place of social dominance by bending that framework to shape our cultural norms and values. Think about our masochistic adherence to work, how we were instilled with the core belief that work is inherently noble and virtuous and the sign of a moral person. Sure, as human beings we have the need for food and shelter, and that instinctual drive was turned into that moral framework, and then that moral framework was bent, so now we've been propagandized into this modern dystopia, where you've got millions of people spending most of their lives staring at spreadsheets or breaking their bodies in construction sites, believing that this unnecessary self-destruction is somehow virtuous, and all of it is to maintain a broken capitalist system that keeps a minority class of wealthy elites at the head of the table. When you have this realization that maybe this modern conception of work isn't the way we should be spending our lives, you're met with reflexive hostility because you're breaking from that mythological framework. Suddenly, you're a lazy freeloader who doesn't want to work, or even worse, you're an intellectual. Because one of the major ways this framework is able to be maintained is through the demonization of intellectualism. They've painted this broad brush that says that intellectuals are the opposite of the mythological framework. Instead of hard workers trying to make a living, intellectuals are soft and weak, and they live inside an ivory tower spreading falsehoods about this great nation. They're arrogant and look down on the poor and working class. You have to demonize the intellectual because critical thinking is what crashes the system. The ability to recognize the hypocrisies and flaws in our current capitalist state is one of the greatest threats to its continued existence. And now that you've demonized intellectualism, it's much easier to make people believe the absurd lies that hold the system in place. For example, you convince people that billionaires fit into that idea of the self-made man, just a hard worker that carved out a place for himself in this free marketplace. But you completely ignore that most of the wealthy elite are generationally wealthy, meaning they inherited their fortunes in businesses, and you gloss over the fact that they maintain their places of wealth by grossly underpaying workers and using their fortunes to lobby politicians to enact legislation that gives them millions in tax cuts. And yes, some of these taxes would be used to propagate this corrupt system, but that tax money would also be used to fund schools and healthcare and public services. But if you underfund all of those important societal programs, the path to wealth becomes even harder for the average American. In fact, if you associate beneficial social programs with being against the ideals of self-determination and rugged individualism, if you put in place the erroneous idea that providing help and resources to the poor and underprivileged is actually perpetuating their inherent laziness and need for handouts, then you've done the work of the billionaire class. You've cut off tens of thousands of Americans' ability to find upward social mobility. These wealthy elites maintain their status by actively working to deny other people the privileges they were born with. But we've been propagandized to believe that these are the most virtuous, hardworking, and righteous among us. And if you dare to suggest that maybe there's a different system of government and economics that would benefit more people, you're immediately met with derision, because we've been bred to believe that the only truly great system is capitalism, and all of the other ones, particularly the evils of communism and socialism, would lead to a complete societal collapse. Our current system, which has millions of Americans in poverty, not knowing where their next meal is coming from, living paycheck to paycheck, literally dying in the streets, is the best system? I'm not going to pretend that we aren't living in one of the greatest times of excess in all of human history, but to use that as a justification to maintain this broken system is to completely shut down your ability to strive for something better. So how do you discredit people like myself saying this stuff out loud? You've demonized intellectualism. Sure, that works on certain sectors of the population, but now you need to discredit the people still talking. And you just lean on that American mythology again. Because the people speaking against this great system have to be wrong. And not just wrong, but willfully spreading lies and misinformation. They're bad people. They're evil people trying to break the system and ruin your way of life. They've gone from neighbors and friends you can cordially disagree with to an enemy that needs to be eliminated. And you can use this tactic not only against the people that speak against the grift, but any group you want to other and dehumanize. Transgender folks are just trying to live their lives, right? Sure, but how can we dehumanize that group? How can we make them at odds with the American mythology and way of life? Well, we basically accuse them of being groomers and pedophiles, of trying to poison the minds and bodies of our children. Now they're the enemy. What about undocumented immigrants who seemingly fit into the American mythology? After all, they're just trying to make something of themselves, right? They're just trying to carve a place in this great land. Surely they can't be the enemy. Well, actually, they're violent criminals. You just need to cherry pick a statistical outlier of a news story and make that fictional narrative a reality. And of course, they're stealing the jobs of hardworking Americans. Any group they want you to hate will get this treatment. They will dehumanize them, find reasons they break from the American mythos, and find justification for turning them into a dehumanized enemy. This is how you get a population of otherwise docile people to commit atrocities against their neighbors. It's not a matter of political disagreement at this point, but a moral fight for the life of the country. This is how the Germans dehumanized Jewish people and how Southern politicians dehumanized freed slaves in the Jim Crow South. And even with all of this propagandizing and dehumanizing, they still need to completely neuter dissent because that is the great internal threat. Our ability to speak freely and communicate ideas is a danger beyond the pale because it has the potential to create empathy. So they work to make our language useless. If you see what's happening and call it out as fascism, they lob the accusation right back at you. Soon, fascist is a meaningless term. Parallels to similar historic times are met with the same level of dismissive derision. They have a necessity for language to only mean what they want it to mean at any given moment. How can you criticize an apparatus that controls the meaning of the words you use to criticize them? None of this would be possible without the complicity of the media. Media is a capitalist enterprise, and so it serves the will of the wealthy elite. This is how you end up with this dangerously false idea that news agencies need to cover both sides equally, as if somehow these diametrically opposed political parties maintain equality in all things, that somehow the middling, ineffectual, feckless Democratic Party is somehow equivalent to the authoritarian cult of the Republican Party. It takes almost no thought to realize how patently absurd the idea is, but we cling to it because it allows these wealthy elites to normalize their extremism, sedating the population into supporting authoritarianism. If you want an amazing example of all of this in action, then look no further than COVID. And I can tell you, as I just said that word, a portion of the population immediately got triggered. During the height of the pandemic, over 1 million American citizens died. It was one of the biggest tragedies of our lives, and yet you wouldn't think that given how we talk about it now. A sizable portion of the population firmly believes the conspiracy theory that COVID was an engineered bioweapon created by doctors and pharmaceutical companies, that the vaccine was at best a placebo placebo, but more likely another bioweapon, and this was all done to enrich pharmaceutical companies and instill some kind of dictatorial control over American citizens. How did this conspiracy theory take root? Trump's administration failed terribly to address COVID, and the amount of unnecessary deaths was astronomical. His supporters couldn't live with that reality, so they created an alternative that suited their worldview. And it has all the hallmarks of great propaganda. You base it in some truth. The vaccine didn't eradicate COVID because it was never meant to. It was meant to keep people out of the hospital, which not only prevented countless deaths, but also removed the strain on our healthcare system. But since we've already demonized intellectualism, you have people that think in black and white. Vaccines can only eliminate COVID, and if they didn't do that, then it's all a lie. Masking had to completely stop the spread of the virus, and if it didn't, then it's all a lie. Sheltering in place was meant to end the pandemic, and if it didn't, then it's all a lie. This black and white thinking has no space for the nuanced complexity of trying to deal with a worldwide pandemic, of realizing that pharmaceutical companies and rival nations are worthy of critique, but the looming threat of disease that killed over 7 million people worldwide necessitated putting aside those critiques for a short time. That pharmaceutical companies most likely enrich themselves from the distribution and sale of the vaccine, but given the immediacy and severity of the problem, we didn't have much of another choice but to work with them. And yes, our government should look into and hold accountable any person or organization that directly benefited off of those millions of deaths. But again, black and white thinking has no space for that nuance. Instead, they manufactured a simple conspiracy theory rooted in that mythological framework. They bastardized rugged individualism to be at odds with our collective need to unite. Suddenly, sheltering in place and getting vaccinated were antithetical to our own self-determination, and a complicit media environment took up the cause. In this case, the conspiracy theories were mostly peddled by alt-right grifting podcasters, but major media sources still platformed people who believed in these conspiracies. They worked to make this thinking commonplace and normalize it, and now we have a population primed to deny the next major health concern using this playbook. That is how this whole cycle of American propaganda is used to strike at the core of our deep-rooted American mythology and manipulate us into believing outright falsehoods in the service of the hegemony. With the arrival of Trump's second term in office, the level of gaslighting, a term that's been intentionally sucked of meaning, and propaganda has been and will continue to be astounding. Already, working class people are being duped into believing that the richest man on the planet, who is making media appearances attacking Medicaid and Social Security, is somehow going to be their savior. What we are seeing play out is the attempted dissolution of our representative democracy. Trump is trying to bend that American mythology in a way that makes people believe he should be their king, and while on his surface Trump is the antithesis of all those values, he has spent millions of dollars and has the support of the billionaire class convincing the working class and poor that he is the platonic ideal of American exceptionalism, and millions of them believe it. From here forward, the propaganda will only get more intense, more polarizing, creating enemies of our friends and neighbors, dividing us by race and class and gender, because the more divided we are, the less of a chance we have to salvage the pieces of this broken country. I can't say what the next 4 years, let alone 4 days, are going to hold, but I do not hold out hope for this country. We have been rotting since our founding, and the joists are finally starting to collapse. I can say that the only path out of this is through a rejection of the lies we've been led to believe, a great awakening of the working class, that we aren't each other's enemies, and that the wealthy elite have been lying to us since we've been able to think, a breaking out of our docile, domesticated lives, and, for once, fighting for a world unclouded by the lies of our forefathers.